Here's a continuation focusing on tension, racism, and societal discrimination interwoven into Officer Daniel Hayes' story. Daniel Hayes adjusted his patrol cap and sat on the worn bench beside Eliza Monroe, her presence a stark contrast against the bustling city backdrop. The streets of Bridgeport were never quiet, but this afternoon, the hum of engines and chatter seemed almost oppressive. He handed her half of his sandwich. "You don't have to eat it," he said softly, breaking the silence. "But no one should go hungry." Eliza hesitated, her eyes darting around as if expecting an ambush. She reluctantly took the sandwich, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why would someone like you care about someone like me?" Daniel frowned. He wasn't used to such direct questioning. "Why wouldn't I? You're part of this community too." Eliza's laugh was bitter, echoing through the open space like a crack in glass. "Community? You don't get it, do you? People like me. We're invisible until we're a problem." Her words stung, but Daniel didn't flinch. He'd been a cop for 8 years and had learned to read between the lines. She was right, in a way. Bridgeport's streets bore scars of neglect and division, invisible barriers splitting the community by race, class, and despair. Their conversation was interrupted by the screech of tires. A black sedan pulled up abruptly, and 3 men jumped out, each as rough as the next. Their target wasn't Daniel, it was Eliza. "You think you can keep dodging us, Monroe?" The leader snarled, his skin pale and his words laced with venom. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket and waved it at her. "This ain't charity. You owe us." Daniel stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. "Step back," he commanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. The man sneered. "Look at this, boys. The law's finally here to protect her kind. Must be my lucky day." Racial tension crackled like static in the air. Daniel knew the script too well. He'd seen it play out in different variations. The men were loan sharks preying on the vulnerable, knowing full well that their victims often lacked the resources or the courage to seek help. "I said back off." Daniel's hand moved to his belt, resting near his holstered firearm. "Now." The men hesitated but weren't deterred. "You think we're scared of you?" The leader spat. "We're just collecting what's owed." "This ain't your business, officer." "Anything that happens on my streets is my business," Daniel replied, his gaze unyielding. "She's under my protection now." The standoff lasted mere seconds, but the tension felt like hours. Eventually, the men slunk back into their car, their threats hanging in the air like smoke. Daniel waited until the car disappeared before turning to Eliza. "You need to report them," he said. Eliza shook her head, her expression hollow. "And what happens after that?" "You can't be everywhere, Hayes. People like them. They don't forget." Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated feeling powerless, but he knew she wasn't wrong. The system wasn't built to shield people like Eliza. It barely noticed them. He escorted her to the station anyway, hoping to convince her to at least file a statement. As they walked, Bridgeport revealed its true face. Gentrified storefronts stood next to crumbling tenements. Sidewalks were dotted with potholes, some freshly patched, others left to rot. It was a city at war with itself, and Daniel was caught in the middle. Inside the precinct, the mood shifted. Officers glanced up as Eliza entered, their gazes a mix of pity and disdain. Bridgeport PD wasn't immune to the biases that plagued the community it served. "Who's this?" Officer Jenkins called out, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Another charity case, Hayes?" Daniel ignored him, guiding Eliza to a desk in the corner. But Jenkins wasn't done. "You're wasting your time, man. These people don't want help. They just want handouts." The words struck like a slap. Eliza's face hardened, but she didn't speak. Daniel turned slowly, his voice cold. "Say that again." The room went quiet. Jenkins scoffed but didn't push further. Daniel's reputation wasn't just built on his badge. It was built on respect, earned through actions that many in the precinct lacked the courage to take. After taking her statement, Daniel walked Eliza out. "I'll follow up," he promised. She didn't thank him. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Part gratitude, part disbelief. "You're different, Hayes," she said. "But this system you work for? It ain't gonna change for people like me. Her words stayed with him as he watched her walk away. That night, Daniel sat alone, staring at the badge on his desk. He had joined the force to make a difference, but stories like Eliza's were reminders of how far the journey still was. The following week brought chaos. The loan sharks were back, and this time, they didn't just threaten, they acted. Eliza's makeshift shelter outside the bus station was torched, her few possessions reduced to ash. She was unharmed but terrified. Daniel's frustration boiled over. He launched an investigation, his resolve unshaken even as resistance grew. He faced subtle pushbacks from within the department, delayed paperwork, murmurs of misplaced priorities. But Daniel pressed on, uncovering not just the loan sharks' operations but a web of systemic corruption tying them to powerful figures in the city. The deeper he dug, the more enemies he made, and the more isolated he became. In the end, Bridgeport wasn't kind to its heroes. Daniel Hayes' story became a cautionary tale, a cop who tried to fight the tide and was nearly swallowed by it. But for Eliza, and countless others like her, he was proof that not all was lost. Daniel Hayes found himself meeting Eliza Monroe for lunch nearly every day. It had started as a gesture of kindness, but it quickly became routine. Sitting on the same bench outside the precinct or at a nearby park, Daniel listened as Eliza shared pieces of her life, fragments that painted a picture of resilience forged in fire. She had been a cleaner once, scrubbing offices and hotels until her body gave out. A series of illnesses, undiagnosed, untreated, and unrelenting, forced her to miss work. Her employer let her go without a second thought, and with no safety net, Eliza's life unraveled. The months on the streets had aged her prematurely, but her spirit remained surprisingly unbroken. "I don't want pity," she said one afternoon, tearing into the sandwich Daniel brought. "I just want to start over, get a job, a place to live. It's not too much to ask, is it?" Daniel admired her optimism, but he couldn't ignore the systems that seemed designed to keep people like Eliza down. She had no ID, no fixed address. Without those, even applying for a job was an insurmountable hurdle. One day, their lunch was interrupted. Officer Jenkins sauntered by, his mocking grin as sharp as a blade. "Hayes, I didn't know you were running a charity now," he sneered, eyeing Eliza like she was an insect. "What's next? Are you taking applications for your new homeless outreach program?" "Mind your business, Jenkins," Daniel said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Jenkins wasn't the type to back down. "Just saying, you've got a soft spot for strays. Hope it doesn't bite you someday." He walked off, laughing under his breath. Eliza kept her head down, but Daniel could see the tension in her posture. "You okay?" he asked gently. "Used to it," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with resignation. "You think that's bad? Try walking into a store and having the manager follow you around like you're about to steal something." Her words weighed heavily on Daniel. He knew racism and classism were woven into Bridgeport's fabric, but hearing it firsthand from someone like Eliza was a stark reminder of the uphill battle she faced. He decided then to do more than just share sandwiches. The next day, Daniel brought Eliza a phone and a prepaid plan. "You'll need this," he said, "for job applications, and in case you ever need help." Eliza's eyes filled with gratitude, but before she could thank him, trouble found them again. The same loan sharks from before appeared, their presence as unwelcome as a storm cloud. "Well, well," the leader drawled, his eyes gleaming with malice. "If it isn't our favorite charity case and her knight in shining armor." "Walk away," Daniel said, stepping between them and Eliza. The leader chuckled darkly. "You think you're gonna save her? She owes us, cop. And if she can't pay, maybe you can." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Daniel's hand hovered near his firearm, but he knew drawing it would escalate things dangerously. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice low and firm. The leader smirked. "Oh, we're real scared. But this ain't over, Hayes. Not by a long shot." He spat on the ground before leaving with his cronies. Eliza was visibly shaken. "They're not gonna stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will," Daniel promised. But as he escorted her to a temporary shelter, he couldn't ignore the feeling that the loan sharks were bolder than ever, and that something larger was at play. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's bond with Eliza grew. He helped her navigate paperwork for housing and job applications, but progress was slow. Racism and bureaucracy reared their ugly heads at every turn. One prospective landlord sneered when Eliza mentioned her background. "I don't rent to people like you," he said bluntly. "People like me?" Eliza echoed, her voice steady but her fists clenched. "Yeah, drifters. Trouble," the man replied, slamming the door in her face. Daniel fumed as they walked back to his car. "That's illegal. We can report him." "And what'll that do?" Eliza asked. "Even if they find him, you think he's gonna change?" She was right. The system didn't just fail people like Eliza. It actively worked against them. But Daniel refused to give up. One evening, while Daniel was at home poring over case files, his phone buzzed. It was Eliza. "They're back," she said, her voice trembling. "They're outside the shelter." Daniel grabbed his keys and raced to the shelter. When he arrived, he found the loan sharks leaning against their car, smirking. "This is harassment," Daniel said, his voice cold. "Leave now, or I'll arrest you." The leader laughed. "For what?" "We're just here to check on an old friend." Daniel's patience snapped. He moved to cuff the leader, but one of the cronies lunged at him. A scuffle broke out, chaotic and brutal. Daniel managed to subdue the men, but not before taking a hit to the jaw. Blood trickled down his chin as he hauled them into his car. At the station, Jenkins was waiting. "Heard you had some excitement," he said, his smirk returning. "You really ought to pick your battles, Hayes. People like her aren't worth it." Daniel ignored him, but the words stung. It wasn't just Jenkins. Half the precinct seemed to share his disdain. The unspoken rule was clear: protect the powerful, not the powerless. The next day, Daniel received an anonymous tip about the loan sharks' operations. It led him to a storage unit filled with stolen goods and forged documents, evidence of a much larger criminal enterprise. But as he prepared to file the report, his captain called him in. "Drop it," the captain said curtly. "You're stirring up trouble." Daniel's stomach churned. Trouble for who? "These guys are breaking the law." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Let it go, Hayes." "That's an order." It was a gut punch. Corruption wasn't just lurking in the shadows. It was entrenched in the very institution Daniel had sworn to serve. That night, Daniel met Eliza at their usual bench. "They're trying to shut me down," he admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. Eliza placed a hand on his arm. "You've done more for me than anyone else ever has. Don't lose yourself trying to fix a broken system." Her words gave him strength. Daniel knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but for Eliza, and for every other invisible soul in Bridgeport, he was willing to fight. Daniel handed Eliza a folded newspaper as they sat together on the bench. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an article. "There's a job fair happening next week. It might be worth checking out." Eliza took the paper with tentative hands, her eyes scanning the bold text. "Looks interesting," she muttered, her voice unusually flat. She lingered over the article longer than seemed necessary, nodding absently. Daniel studied her expression. It wasn't curiosity or excitement. It was discomfort. Something about her hesitation struck him as odd. "Eliza," he said gently, "are you okay?" She sighed and lowered the paper, folding it neatly and placing it beside her. "Truth is, I can't really read much. Not enough to get through all that." Her admission caught Daniel off guard. Eliza was resourceful and determined. He hadn't expected illiteracy to be one of the barriers she faced. "You can't read?" "Not well," she said, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I left school young. Had to take care of my siblings after my mom died. Never got a chance to go back. And now," her voice trailed off as she gestured to her tattered clothes and the world around her. Daniel felt a pang of sadness. Illiteracy wasn't just a challenge. It was another layer of humiliation that society had piled onto Eliza. "You've been surviving out here, making it work despite everything," he said, his tone firm but kind. "That takes smarts. Reading is just a skill. It doesn't define your worth." Eliza's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're too kind, Hayes. But out here, people don't see me as worth much." Before Daniel could respond, A voice interrupted them. "Isn't this sweet?" Jenkins drawled, sauntering over with his usual smugness. "Bridgeport's finest playing tutor to the city's charity case." "Not now, Jenkins," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. But Jenkins wasn't done. He snatched the newspaper off the bench, flipping through it dramatically. "Job fair? Huh? Hate to break it to you, but those gigs aren't for people like her. They're looking for someone who can actually fill out the forms." Eliza's face fell, but Daniel rose to his feet, his posture commanding. "That's enough," he said, his voice like steel. "Go find something useful to do." Jenkins smirked but walked away, muttering under his breath. "You're wasting your time, Hayes. Some people are just born to fail." Daniel turned back to Eliza, his heart heavy as he saw the shadow of defeat in her eyes. "Don't listen to him," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out." The next day, Daniel brought Eliza a worn workbook he found at a secondhand store. "We'll start small," he said. "If you want, I'll help you learn." Eliza hesitated, her pride and vulnerability warring within her. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you deserve a chance," Daniel said simply. "Everyone does." Their lessons began in quiet corners of the park, away from prying eyes. At first, Eliza was nervous, stumbling over letters and sounds, her embarrassment evident. But Daniel was patient, encouraging her with every small victory. "I never thought I'd be doing this at my age," she said one afternoon, laughing softly. "Feels like I'm back in grade school." "You're doing great," Daniel said. "You're catching on faster than most kids." As the days turned into weeks, Eliza's confidence grew. She began recognizing words and forming sentences, her excitement palpable. "I can't believe I just read that," she said one day, holding up a simple flyer for a local shelter. "You've got this," Daniel replied, smiling. But their progress wasn't without obstacles. One evening, Daniel and Eliza were interrupted during a lesson. A group of teenagers lingered nearby, their laughter and whispers growing louder. It didn't take long for their mockery to become obvious. "Hey, lady," one of them shouted. "You trying to learn your ABCs? What are you 5?" Eliza froze, her face turning crimson. Daniel glared at the teens, his voice sharp. "Move along." But the ringleader, a lanky boy with a smirk, wasn't deterred. "What's the point? She's still gonna end up back on the streets." "Waste of time." Daniel rose, his imposing figure silencing the group. "I said, move along." The teens scattered, but the damage was done. Eliza closed the workbook, her hands trembling. "Maybe Jenkins is right," she murmured. "Maybe I am wasting your time." Daniel knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "You're not wasting anyone's time. Don't let a bunch of punks, or anyone, tell you who you are." But the incident left a scar. The next few lessons were strained, Eliza's confidence shaken. It wasn't until Daniel showed her a job application that she began to feel hope again. "Look at this," he said, sliding the paper toward her. "It's for a cleaning position at a local hotel. They're looking for someone reliable, no experience required." Eliza scanned the form, her finger tracing the words. "I can read most of it," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "But I'll need help with the rest." "We'll work on it together," Daniel promised. Things took a darker turn when Eliza submitted her application. A week later, she received a call for an interview. Eliza was thrilled, but when she arrived at the hotel, the manager's reaction was anything but welcoming. "You're Eliza Monroe?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes, sir," Eliza replied, trying to mask her nerves. The manager frowned, his eyes scanning her worn clothes and weary face. "I'm afraid the position's been filled." "But you called me for an interview," Eliza said, her voice breaking slightly. "We decided to go with someone else," the manager said curtly, dismissing her with a wave. Eliza left the hotel feeling humiliated and defeated. When she recounted the experience to Daniel, tears streamed down her face. "He didn't even give me a chance," she said. "Just looked at me like I wasn't worth his time." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "That's discrimination," he said. "You deserve better." But as they sat in the park, the weight of the world pressing down on them, Eliza looked up at Daniel, determination glinting in her eyes. "I'm not giving up," she said. "I've come too far." Daniel nodded, his respect for her growing. "We'll keep fighting," he said, one step at a time. Despite the setbacks, Eliza continued her lessons, her resilience unshaken. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Daniel Hayes arrived at the bus station with a tote bag full of books and papers. He placed them on the bench next to Eliza, who was waiting with her usual mix of curiosity and hesitation. Today's lesson was about learning simple sentences. He pulled out a children's book with bright illustrations. "This one's about animals," Daniel said with a smile. "Figured it'd be a good place to start." Eliza chuckled softly, running her fingers over the glossy cover. "Haven't held a book like this since I was a kid," she admitted. "You're going to do great," Daniel reassured her. "Let's start with this page. Read what you can, and I'll help with the rest." Eliza took a deep breath and began to sound out the words, stumbling occasionally but improving with each attempt. Daniel was patient, offering gentle corrections and plenty of encouragement. "See? You're getting it," he said as she successfully read an entire sentence on her own. Their lessons quickly became a regular sight at the bus station. Daniel would arrive with new materials, short articles, simple exercises, or picture books, and the two would sit together, oblivious to the bustling city around them. Some passers-by paused to watch, their faces lighting up with admiration. "That's Officer Hayes, isn't it?" a middle-aged woman said to her friend one afternoon. "I've seen him here every day, teaching that poor lady to read. It's wonderful what he's doing." But not everyone was impressed. One day, as Daniel was guiding Eliza through a worksheet, Jenkins appeared, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. He sauntered over, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at this. Bridgeport's finest turned kindergarten teacher." Daniel didn't look up. "Move along, Jenkins." "Oh, come on," Jenkins said, leaning against a nearby lamppost. "This isn't part of your job, Hayes. You're supposed to be keeping the streets safe, not playing savior." Daniel turned to him, his expression cold. "Helping someone get back on their feet is part of keeping the streets safe. You'd know that if you cared." Jenkins snorted. "You think teaching her to read is going to change anything? People like her don't change, Hayes. You're wasting your time." Eliza kept her head down, gripping the book tightly, her knuckles white. Daniel clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. "She's already changing," he said evenly, "and I won't stop until she gets the chance she deserves." Jenkins laughed and walked away, but not before muttering, "You're too soft, Hayes. It'll get you killed one day." Despite Jenkins' words, Daniel's dedication never wavered. Each day, Eliza grew more confident. She could now read full paragraphs and even write simple sentences. Her pride was evident, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for her determination. One morning, as they were working through a particularly tricky passage, a group of teenagers passed by. At first, they didn't pay much attention, but soon, one of them stopped and pointed. "Hey, isn't that the homeless lady from the shelter?" he said loudly. Eliza froze, her face flushing red. The teenagers laughed, their mocking voices cutting through the air. "Looks like she's learning to read," another boy sneered. "Good luck with that. Maybe she'll make it to first grade by next year." Daniel stood abruptly, his towering frame silencing the group. "Apologize," he demanded, his voice cold. The teenagers hesitated, their bravado faltering under Daniel's glare. One of them muttered a half-hearted apology before they scattered, still snickering as they walked away. Eliza kept her eyes on the book, her shoulders hunched. "I'm used to it," she said softly. "People always find a way to remind me what I am." Daniel crouched beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "What you are is brave. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The lessons continued, but the ridicule didn't stop. On another afternoon, a well-dressed man approached, his face twisted in disapproval. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his tone haughty. "Don't you think you should be doing actual police work instead of this charity project?" Daniel stood, his eyes narrowing. Helping someone improve their life is police work. The man scoffed. "This isn't what we pay you for. She's a lost cause, and everyone knows it." Eliza shrank back, the man's words hitting her like a blow. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "She's not a lost cause. And if you don't have anything helpful to say, I suggest you move on." The man huffed and walked away, muttering under his breath. Eliza looked at Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears. "You don't have to defend me," she said. "I'm used to people thinking I'm worthless." "But you're not," Daniel said firmly. "And I'll remind you of that every day if I have to." One evening, as Daniel was packing up the lesson materials, Eliza hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Daniel replied. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people wouldn't even look at me, let alone help." Daniel paused, searching for the right words. "Because I see someone who's fighting, despite everything the world's thrown at her. And because I know what it's like to feel invisible." Eliza looked at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. Finally, she nodded, a small smile breaking through the sadness. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." The progress was undeniable. Eliza could now read job listings, write short responses, and even navigate simple paperwork. Daniel found himself inspired by her resilience, but he also knew the fight wasn't over. One day, Eliza handed him a flyer she had picked up. "There's a training program at the community center," she said, her excitement barely contained. "They teach job skills and help with placements. I want to try." Daniel beamed. "That's a great idea. Let's get you signed up." But as they began the registration process, they hit another roadblock. The woman at the front desk looked skeptical as Eliza handed over her information. "You're applying?" she asked, her tone laced with condescension. "Yes," Eliza said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. The woman sighed. "We have limited spots, and these programs are competitive. Maybe this isn't the right fit for you." Daniel stepped forward, his tone firm. "She's qualified. You'll process her application." The woman pursed her lips but complied, her disdain obvious. Eliza looked at Daniel, her gratitude clear. "No one said this would be easy," Daniel said as they walked out. "But you're proving every day that you belong." And as Eliza took her first steps into the program, she knew that, no matter the challenges, she wasn't fighting alone. A few months had passed, and Eliza Monroe's progress in learning to read was nothing short of remarkable. She sat on the weathered bench at the bus station with a children's book in her lap. Daniel Hayes watched as she carefully read aloud a paragraph, her voice steady and confident. When she finished, her smile was so bright it felt like it could light up the whole street. "I did it!" Eliza exclaimed, clutching the book to her chest. Daniel clapped enthusiastically, drawing curious looks from a few passers-by. "That was perfect, Eliza," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "Not a single mistake." Eliza beamed, the joy of her accomplishment washing away years of doubt and humiliation. For a brief moment, she felt like the world might finally be opening its arms to her. News of their daily lessons had quietly spread among the locals. Some praised Daniel for his dedication, while others were less kind. The shift came when a young journalist, Kelly Ramirez, noticed them during her commute. Intrigued by the sight of a uniformed officer teaching a woman to read, she approached Daniel one afternoon. "Officer Hayes, I'm writing a piece about community heroes," she said. "Can I interview you and Eliza?" Daniel hesitated. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about her. If she's okay with it, then sure." Eliza seemed unsure, her usual guardedness returning. "What if people laugh?" she asked Daniel later. "They won't," Daniel reassured her. "This is your story, Eliza. It's about how far you've come." The article, titled "A Cop, a Bench, and a New Beginning," was published a week later. Kelly painted a vivid picture of Daniel's commitment and Eliza's resilience, framing their story as a beacon of hope in a city often divided by class and race. The response was overwhelming. Within days, donations began pouring in, bags of clothes, stacks of books, and handwritten letters of encouragement. Local businesses reached out, offering everything from meals to free training programs. Eliza was stunned by the outpouring of support. "I never thought people would care this much," she said to Daniel, her voice thick with emotion. "They see what I see," Daniel replied. "Someone who deserves a chance." Not everyone shared the enthusiasm. At the precinct, Jenkins had found a new angle for his ridicule. He slapped the newspaper onto Daniel's desk one morning, the article's headline glaring up at them. "Well, look who made the front page," Jenkins sneered. "Bridgeport's newest saint." Daniel didn't look up. "If you're here to cause trouble, save your breath." Jenkins leaned closer, his smirk widening. "You think this changes anything? She'll always be a charity case. And now you've got the whole city thinking you're some kind of savior. It's pathetic." Daniel stood, his voice low and measured. "What's pathetic is tearing people down when they're trying to get back up. You've got something to say? Say it where it matters." Jenkins backed off, but the damage was done. His words lingered like a bad taste, feeding the insecurities that Daniel tried so hard to bury. The community's support had tangible effects on Eliza's life. She was offered a part-time job at a local bookstore, where the owner had been moved by her story. "It's nothing fancy," the woman said when Eliza came in for her first day. "Just stocking shelves and tidying up. But it's a start." Eliza accepted with gratitude, her hands trembling as she signed the paperwork. She hadn't held a job in years, and the thought of re-entering the workforce was both exhilarating and terrifying. The challenges came quickly. On her second day, a customer pointedly asked, "Weren't you that homeless woman from the article?" Eliza stiffened, her face flushing. I was," she stammered. The man sneered. "Figured as much. Don't mess up my order." She kept her composure, but when the man left, she retreated to the stockroom, her hands shaking. The bookstore owner found her there and offered quiet reassurance. "Don't let them get to you," she said. "You're doing great." Despite these incidents, Eliza's confidence grew. One evening, she sat with Daniel on their usual bench, holding a new book she had borrowed from the bookstore. "I never thought I'd be able to do this," she said, flipping through the pages. Daniel smiled. "This is just the beginning." But not everyone celebrated her progress. The loan sharks who had tormented her weren't pleased with her newfound stability. One evening, as Eliza left the bookstore, she found them waiting outside. "Look who's all fancy now," the leader sneered, blocking her path. "Think you're too good for us, huh?" Eliza's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I don't owe you anything anymore." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "That's not how it works, sweetheart. You don't just get to walk away." Eliza tried to push past them, but they shoved her against the wall. "You think that cop can save you?" the leader hissed. "He's not here now, is he?" Before things could escalate, a bystander intervened, shouting at the men to leave her alone. They retreated, but not without a parting threat. "This isn't over." Eliza was shaken, but she refused to let fear dictate her life. When she told Daniel what had happened, he was livid. "You need protection," he said. "I can't rely on you forever," Eliza replied, her voice firm. "I need to stand on my own." Daniel couldn't argue with her, but the incident reignited his determination to dismantle the loan sharks' operation. The article's reach extended further than Daniel or Eliza had anticipated. A local activist group contacted Daniel, offering to help Eliza secure stable housing and long-term support. The group's leader, a fiery woman named Carmen, met with Eliza at a coffee shop. "We've read your story," Carmen said. "You've inspired a lot of people. Let us help you take the next step." Eliza hesitated, unsure of how to accept such generosity. "I'm not used to people caring," she admitted. Carmen smiled. "Get used to it. You've earned it." As weeks turned into months, Eliza's life continued to transform. She moved into a small apartment arranged through the activist group, and her job at the bookstore blossomed into a full-time position. But the journey was far from over. Racism, judgment, and the echoes of her past still lingered, casting long shadows over her progress. Through it all, Daniel remained by her side, a steady presence in a world that often felt overwhelming. And as they sat together one evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Eliza turned to him and said, "You didn't just teach me to read, Hayes. You taught me to believe in myself." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You did that on your own, Eliza. I just reminded you of what you were always capable of."